give me one shot here on a blue chip stock, believe me, Kevin, the only problem you're gonna have is that you didn't buy more.
Nobody knows if the stock is going to go up, down, sideways, or in circles.
What's going on, NBA draft fans? Your boy's back. The Wolf of Ball Street. Your favorite draft analyst. My name's Corey Tulaba. Albert Garbage Time again cannot be with us today. So I had to call in the big guns. A familiar face, a familiar voice, if you're listening to this on the podcast feed. One of my dear friends, somebody I'm very excited to see on the screen, chop it up about the NBA draft. Had me a little bit jealous in my feelings because he popped up on another platform. Shout out to Chuck from Chucking Darts, great show. But had me a little in my feelings. So I said, you know what? I got to get him back on the No Ceilings platform. We're here with Nathan Grubel, Draft Deeper. Nathan, my man, on the screen. What's going on?
Oh, Corey, it's great to be back chatting with you. I mean, not that you and I ever stopped talking, or Maxwell or Rucker, or any of the guys over No Ceilings. We're always talking about draft. We're always talking about basketball. But to actually do it on this podcast feed, on this video feed, we're literally live for so many viewers. Everybody's already popping in the comments already, by the way. So that's good to see. But I'm doing well, trying out a new setup here as we were talking about before the pod even started. But I'm excited. I'm excited for the topic we have today. I think we're gonna have some interesting conversations about some prospects. We'll put it that way. We already have a comment that this should be an explosive episode. Draft is the definition of volatile, and I literally couldn't agree more.
Yeah, shout out to Mr. Ray in the comments. Shout out to everybody watching live on YouTube right now on a 3 p.m. edition on a Tuesday. So it's going to be explosive for sure.
Hey, you know what? If they can do the second round of the draft on a Thursday afternoon at 4 p.m., we can do a pod on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock.
You know, this is a draft show, and that's kind of breaking news. This is going to be the first, 2-day draft. Yeah. And when the time came out on the Thursday, Nathan, you and I were both East Coast guys. I looked at it and I said, that rocks. As much as anything could rock. And this is what it feels like to be on the West Coast for a 7 p.m. East Coast time tip-off. I love it. I very, very much so love it. In the chat, Alex says it's a very good time for Europeans like me. So Dirty Dancer not as happy. Screw this 4 p.m. draft crap. So the comments are turning just as volatile as this episode is going to be.
Hey, you know what, man? Listen, I'm old, right? I like to get into bed by 10 o'clock. So honestly, anything that's going to wrap up before 10 p.m. in the draft space usually doesn't happen. We're used to the 11:30 p.m. or midnight end to the draft. So trust me, I'm a fan.
Yeah, during a work week, come on, this is gold, exactly. Everybody. But yeah, we decided to do this episode on the 2024 NBA Draft Volatility Index because, as the comments have already stated, this draft is very volatile, and the outcomes for the players in this draft, for a lot of them, are volatile, right? And you could be super high on a prospect, and a lot of times as evaluators, we always like to talk about, what is their ceiling. And at No Ceilings, we don't place a cap on what a player can eventually become. However, just because a player might have a high ceiling, it doesn't mean that they are going to reach it necessarily. There's a lot that goes into it, from how they adjust to becoming a pro, new money, what team they go on, who's in front of them, how are they going to handle being sent down to the G League potentially as a lottery pick, which is becoming more and more of the norm. So there's a lot that goes into how a player is going to develop. And for some of these guys, they've shown flashes. But flashes can entice you, doesn't mean that those flashes are going to be something that happen on a consistent basis. So we wanted to kind of break down 5 guys each that we think could be pretty volatile. And we're going to give a 1 to 10 rating on just how volatile a prospect is, with 10 being the most volatile and 1 being the least volatile. So if you get a 1, you're probably not very volatile. If you get a 1, you're probably not going to be on this episode. However, who knows? Because we didn't share our rankings. So, we might have differing opinions on certain guys. So Nathan, as the guest, I am going to let you decide which guy you want to bring up first so we can talk about why that player may or may not be volatile.
Sure. I mean, we quite literally didn't talk about the order and how we were going to do this. So I'll pose the question to the host. Do you want to start with the least volatile rank guys, or do you want to start off right off the bat? We're going to go disaster mode first. What do you want to do?
Well, I thought we would kind of mix and match. That way we're not too positive and not too negative all at one time. We can balance everything out.
That's completely fair. Hey, come on. This is Draft Deeper coming back on those ones. We don't do negativity over here. We try to keep it positive. But for the spirit of this episode, we are going to lay out some potentially negative outcomes for some prospects. We wanted to talk about 5 boomer bust guys. So I'll start off with someone who, listen, I do have this guy very high in my personal rankings. He's been a top 10 prospect for me this entire cycle. I created my first board that I was sharing with scouts and executives behind the scenes back around January, end of January, beginning of February. Tyler Smith from the G League Ignite program is not left my top 10. 6'10" forward, weighed in at 224 pounds, the draft combine. I gave him a volatility index rating of 6. So kind of like middle of the road, teetering towards the upward side as far as the boom category, right? So the bust category, excuse me. So here's some reasons why there could be a boom, right? Here's a big reason why he can work is that he's a consistent 3-point shooter at 6'10", both spotting up as well as shooting off the move. He's a transition athlete. He's a secondary rim protector, a capable finisher, and he's still young and learning how to impact the game from a passing perspective, as well as he's still growing into his role on the defensive side of the ball, right? He averaged 14 points per game, 5 rebounds, shot 47% from the field, 36% from 3-point range, 1.8 stocks in the G League as a 19-year-old. And in case anyone hasn't seen the Ignite program this past year, they weren't a very good team, right? There was a lot of very volatile, right? So there's a lot of negatives that you can point to on that team, but Tyler Smith was one of the guys who you looked at and said, he's actually been a bright spot, a diamond in the rough in terms of these prospects because he knew his role and he stuck to it and he didn't try to do too much, right? He got out of the way of some of the other guys and he just said, you know what? This team needs shooting. This team needs floor spacing. That's something I can do. I'm not going to try and get too fancy with it. He spotted up from the corners. He hit above the break threes. He even hit some shots in the mid-range off some movement, off 1 or 2 dribbles around the free throw line. He kept it simple, ran the floor in transition, dunked it when he could. And I think a guy coming into the NBA who knows his role, especially in this draft class, is something incredibly valuable, let alone someone who, as I said, he's still 19 years old, still growing into his frame, and has plenty more that he can develop into. So those are a lot of the positives and why I like Tyler Smith. Corey, what do you want to add about Tyler before we get into some of the potential reasons for bust?
Yeah, so you and I both have had opportunities to see Tyler, you know, previous to this year when he was with the Overtime Elite. And he was a guy that immediately stood out to me when I saw him. The first time I saw him was in a high school in New Jersey for like a high school tournament thing, with local New Jersey products that were like high level prospects and versus the Overtime Elite teams. And just in layup lines, I was like, okay, this dude's like 6'9", 6'10", and he's very athletic. Jumper looks super, super smooth. He's a lefty. Everyone knows how I love lefties. And I was just like, I want to see what this kid looks like now in gameplay. And, it was not great. It was like you saw like the raw like talent, right, the flashes or whatever, but there wasn't a consistency with it. And so I was excited to watch him this year as a guy that could potentially break out in this class just because of the tools. And I thought, the freedom that he'd have to maybe expand on some of that stuff with the Ignite team would be intriguing. And what I was surprised that like he wasn't really trying to expand his game and do stuff that was crazy out on the court. And that was appealing because like you mentioned, he actually did kind of keep his game simple and play a role. and kind of just figure out a way to fit in amongst all of the people that were experimenting. And so that to me was a big positive. I also, I got a chance to break down film with him. If you're here on the YouTube channel, after you watch us discuss all these guys, you can go watch his film session I did with him. He knows his weaknesses. He can talk, he can think the game. He knows his role. I think those are all positives. And like you said, he could really shoot. He's got size. He's got length. He can block shots. He has all the tools, right? And that's why he's intriguing. At times I've kind of thought, like, if he had chosen to go to college, right, and he had kind of just gone through that system, and if you watch the Ignite program this year, there weren't many consequences to, making a terrible mistake.
Right.
In the same way that you may have that consequence if you're playing on a college team, a team that's trying to win games in college. You miss a rotation, you throw a bad pass, your coach is going to be like, "Hey, buddy, come take a seat next to me. We got a 24-year-old, 6th-year COVID grad guy who's, 240 pounds, whatever."
Things that definitely happened to him with Ignite, by the way, that we can get into. But yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah.
So, but I've thought, like, if he was in that situation and the game was a little slower, the paint was packed a little tighter, spacing it wasn't as great, could he have had the kind of breakout that Taylor Hendricks had?
Great
And
question.
We'll never know. So, completely theoretical. But I do think that he's a guy who did immediately, because of the fact that he was really effective early playing within himself and showing these tools. He did hop back onto the radar after kind of falling off of it with the Ignite program, because he was a very, highly touted guy, and but he developed there. He got great coaching, played for Ryan Gomes, who's now with the Blazers. And he clearly has made strides, developed. The shooting became more consistent. I thought he did a lot of good things. Now, if we're going to discuss, why does Tyler Smith not work at the next level?
So there's a few flaws in his game that we would definitely want to lay out there, right? I think the most of the bad would start on the defensive side of the ball, right? He had inconsistent footwork defensively on the perimeter and defending in the pick and roll, right? Low rebounding rate for a bigger forward. You're seeing how important rebounding is, especially in the playoffs. In some of these situations, you need guys who are going to crash the glass hard on both ends of the floor. Didn't quite do that at a great level with the G League Ignite. The good news is he still has plenty of room to continue filling out his frame, to get stronger, but you didn't see that motor all the time with that program. So that definitely is a red flag. And then defensively, he's not a true rim protector / projectable 5-man, right? Like, I think if you're looking to draft Tyler Smith in the lottery, you see him as a power forward, likely full-time, or even a 4-3, depending on how confident you are in terms of him actually stepping out and expanding his perimeter game offensively. But you'd also probably want him to be able to play at least some backup minutes at the 5, right? He didn't necessarily prove that he could do that with the Ignite program. And then offensively, he's still figuring out ways how to contribute off the dribble, both from a scoring perspective as well as from a passing perspective. So these things, they are red flags. My question, I guess, to you would be, in terms of his inconsistencies and the reasons why he may not work as a player, do you think a lot of it's mostly wrapped up in the fact that the game's probably just moving a little too fast for him at this current stage? And then how do you think, if that is the case, is that something you're seeing trend more upwards with prospects if they're given enough time to actually read and react and develop to and adjust to the NBA game? Or do you think that feel is becoming so important to where if you're not at a certain spot coming out of the gate, you may not get there to where you need to be in the NBA? You might be one of these guys who ultimately falls back.
So to give my score, I had him at a 6.5.
Okay, so we're basically right in line. Yeah.
So pretty close to where you had him. And I gave him that because of the defensive stuff. I do think the passing, I'm less worried about, just from the perspective of he plays a lot as a play finisher. And you definitely need to be able to make a one more and, process the game quickly and whatnot. But a lot of what he is going to be doing offensively is going to be very simplistic. And because of the fact that not only can he shoot it, but he can also pressure the rim as a vertical lob threat in a pick and roll. Like, he has multiple ways that he can play finish to where it's not necessarily predictable. which not every prospect we're going to talk about today who has a simplistic game has those multiple avenues to score, even in that kind of play finisher role. But the defense, when you look at him and you look at how fluid he is and how good he is as an athlete, he should be able to move on the perimeter better than he's shown. And that's kind of where I'm at, where part of it, it's like, was part of it just the fact that, like, if you did get beat off the bounce and the fact that you weren't necessarily going to be pulled in that situation, does part of that go into, like, well, because there's no consequence to it, I'm not necessarily going to play hard every single possession. And I think you can make that case with all of their prospects that, like,
Sure.
they weren't locked in 100% of the time. And you add into the fact that you have how many young guys all playing at one time, to where it's like, if there's not many vets who are going to be in the right spots, that sometimes even the defense could look a little bit worse because, all right, you got blown by, but now there's no low man there, and now you're giving up a dunk or a layup. You know what I mean? So on one hand, I don't know if the defense is going to be as bad as it looked at times out on the perimeter.
I will say that I've had multiple pro scouts tell me that they think his feet are like cement out there moving around. I know there's a difference between moving laterally versus just straight line drive speed, but the fact that I do see him move as light as he does up and down the court, how easy he's able to get up off 1 or 2 feet. You talked about the vertical aspect of his game. I don't think I can quite, diminish his footwork and say that his feet move like cement, like they're in cement on that side of the ball. But I think definitely there is an aspect to it of what you're talking about.
I think part of that too goes into the instinctually, like, if you're thinking, like, your feet might look slower than they're capable of looking overall. Now, I give him that 6.5 because there's no guarantee that he does figure that out. And taking the optimistic view there, that he could, if he doesn't, it is a tough sell to get him on the floor because if he's not going to be, he's a tweener. If he's not going to be a big time rim protector. And I think that's something to kind of consider with, like, these, he's going to be a great rim protector prospects. I like him as a weak side rim protector. It's like, even like the elite shot blockers in the NBA are not blocking a ton of shots in a game, or maybe the elite guys are, your Victor, your Gobert, but, like, even still, they're more like rim deterrence and they're getting some blocks versus, a weak side shot blocker. If you're like a wing and you do it, it's like, what are you going to average? 0.7 or 0.8 blocks a game? Maybe you average like 1.1, at some point in your career, so if that's all he is, that sells a little tougher. Now, the reason that, to answer your other question of, like, can you see him moving past that, right? And finding a way, the fact that he does have a solidified role offensively and he can shoot gives him a little bit more runway than some of the other prospects. Now, like, I've seen him mocked to, like, New York a lot, and, like, I don't know if that's a spot where he would have the best chance to succeed, because I do think that, like, you're not going to get real game reps to work stuff out like you're going to be in Westchester.
Yeah.
And like, I feel like he's going to need, like, the real game type reps. So, like, he needs to go to a spot where he can make some mistakes and he can learn and he can be held accountable. And so I think it's going to be very fit dependent, but I think the fact that he does have those strengths offensively does give him a good opportunity to kind of figure it out at some point, even if it's a little bit longer of a process than some might think. And, I mentioned Taylor Hendricks earlier. Like, he spent a lot of time this year in the G League.
Yes,
there's a top 10 pick. Didn't, like, he's still not going to come back next year and be ready to rock as, like, a super effective, 3-and-D forward tweener center, right? Like, so these things do take time. There is a process, and I do think Taylor was a little bit more ready to go. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time for Tyler, but I think because he can shoot and he is athletic and his game is simplistic, I do think he has a shot to figure it out.
And that's what I come back to too. Like, how many guys at 6'10" are actually hitting threes at the clip that he was able to already from that back far back of a line, at the NBA level. He was 38% on all of his catch and shoot threes. He was 38% on all of his jumpers overall. You're talking about how he already has that element to his game. He is a good finisher around the basket. That defined role is something that you're not finding 6'10" guys or even 6'9" guys in abundance around the NBA actually being able to do that at the level that he's already showing he is. And listen, jump shooting is one of those things that if you are good at it, you're only going to keep taking more shots in a practice gym. You're only going to get more reps. You're probably only going to keep improving on that aspect of your game. So it wouldn't even surprise me if he becomes a 39, 40% three-point shooter on decent volume in the NBA. And if you can do that at 6'10", you already have a role. You already have a way to get yourself minutes on the floor. When you brought up the New York mock, I think it's actually funny how like it's not only just him, but I see a number of players in these mocks who are projected to go to the Knicks. And it's like, if you don't defend at a certain level, you're not going to get on the floor for Tibbs, period. Right? If you aren't physical, if you aren't hustling every single play, rebounding, at least solid defensively, you're not going to earn minutes for him. So I think when we are looking at some of these players we're trying to mock to the Knicks, I would agree with you. I wouldn't like that fit either. I think he has some places where I think he can certainly fit and potentially get minutes out of the gate. But I also wouldn't be shocked, like you said, if he spends a lot of time in the G League even next year, because, I mean, yeah, the number of top 10 lottery picks that you and I are still probably pretty high on who spent a lot of time in the G League last year, I think that just speaks to the skill curve and where the NBA is going overall. That's just how far the gap is. And I think we also need to keep that in mind when we're evaluating these players as well. If they aren't immediately booming right away in year one, that doesn't mean it can't be attainable for them in year two or year three if they're hitting the right bars.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. All right, let's hit one of my prospects. And I think what's fun is I didn't go back and look at your like big board that you put out on your Twitter after you initially put it out. That way I didn't see where you were at with some of the guys that I had chosen. So we gave, a 6.5. So kind of middle of the road type outcome, not too bad, not too great. So I'm going to go with somebody who I have a little bit higher as a little bit more volatile. And he's starting to pick up some steam again at this part of the cycle. And I'm going to go with USC's Isaiah Collier. And I'm going to give him a 7 for volatility.
Okay.
All right. So this is a guy who he came in number one prospect, or, one of the guys who were ranked at one time as the number one prospect in the class. Was listed at 6'5" at USC. Bunch of us went to the Hoop Summit he was at, and we knew that he was going to measure shorter than that. He came on really strong at the beginning of the year. Looked like he might be potentially the number one pick. Then really tailed off to where it was like he should maybe take the same route DJ Wagner took, where it's like this guy's probably not draftable. Got hurt, came back, and played well when he came back. So he's had a real roller coaster season, a real volatile season of highs and lows, and his draft stock has been volatile, where it's gone from potentially in the number one pick, and now he's consistently being mocked anywhere from I've seen people have him again in the top 5, and he's a no-brainer top 5. How are people not going to mock him in the top 5? To he's getting mocked at 25 in the draft. And, I think that we've seen with these prospects who have a lot of talent, he could be the second guy on a number of teams' boards. But if their first guy is there, somebody could drop. We saw Cam Whitmore drop way further than people expected last year. These things happen every single year. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities that he does go somewhere in the lottery. And it's not out of the realm of the possibilities that he gets picked in the early to mid to potentially late 20s. Now I have him, for if you haven't watched Collier and you're just getting into the draft, he measured in, I think 6'2.5". He's about 6'3". He's probably gonna be like 6'3.75", 6'4" in shoes, 6'5" wingspan. Very strong, kind of running back, downhill style. Great first step burst, but not super vertically explosive. I think only had 6 dunks. He got blocked 27 times at the rim, but he does have some hang time. He is a really creative passer, even though he's not always the best decision maker. And he struggles as a shooter at pretty much every level. He's not the worst shooter in the world, but it's definitely not a positive. Now, I don't think that he is volatile in the sense of like, is this guy an NBA player? Because I do think he is pretty easily a guy who is an NBA player who is going to be in the league, and he's going to get multiple chances if he doesn't work out with his first team.
Yep.
However, the reason I think that he's volatile, because if he gets drafted high, he's going to have expectations. And it's really hard to be a guard with his style, that downhill style, to be even like take a team to the playoffs as its best or second best player. The Sacramento Kings did not make the playoffs this year with like a almost fully formed De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. The league is so talented. And for him, where he's at right now, unless that jumper, turns into a positive, or at least he gets it to be where people are really respecting him with it.
Yep.
I struggle to see how he's super successful playing off of other guys as somebody who doesn't have a 30% usage, which is what he had this year. So I think that volatility of like, all right, well, if he's given the keys, I think he'll probably put up numbers. I'm not sure if it's going to lead to winning, but how can he blend with some of your other guys who also need usage and not serving as your engine in 2024, where it's not really the way basketball is played? And like, you can't really look at Luka because he's an outlier, like who like super high usage guy. It's not to say it can't work, but there's just some he's a terrible rebounder, right? Like that's another thing. Somebody who is as strong and
defense. Yep.
Like the defense, when the effort's there, he's pretty good because he's strong and he can move, but the effort's not always there. But I do think it got better at the end of the year. So I just think his outcomes are pretty volatile depending on where he's drafted and what the expectation is. And I don't think when you're the number one player in your class at some point, you're like, I'm going to be a backup point guard. Like you're a one and done. You went to USC. You used to be the number one pick. Your expectation is like, I think I could be an all-star. Yep. And if those are the expectations, can you buy in to potentially not having that outcome? And if that outcome doesn't exist, how can you contribute to a winning team when the ball's not in your hands?
Exactly. So I don't think you said specifically where you have him on your board. I can tell you I have him at 16 on my board.
That's about where I have him.
So there's two things that I get hung up on when we're talking about Isaiah Collier, and I'll be curious to get your opinion on both of them. The first thing would be in regards to his aggressive style, his downhill style, right? That's the thing that everyone's pointing to. If you have him top 3, top 5, whatever on your board, you're pointing to the fact that he's been able to create so many paint touches that eventually it's just going to wind up being a positive at the NBA level. My two-part question would be, number one, do you think that strength that he has as a downhill driver is an outlier skill for him? In other words, is it among the top X% of players who play a similar physical style in the NBA? And then my second question related to that would be coming back to one of the points you made in terms of him being turnover prone in regards to his decision making. We talk a lot about how important advantage creation is, right? Being able to actually create that advantage for your team. But how valuable is that advantage if you don't trust what's going to happen next once you've created that advantage? And those are the two things I keep coming back to with him. I'm erring on the more pessimistic side for both, which is why I have him at 16 on my board and I don't have him as a top 10 prospect. I'm assuming you fall in a similar camp with both those questions.
I do, because I think that he's great. Like, even if teams are going to go under, I do think there's some craft to where he'll get a guy on his hip and he'll snake the screen and he'll, but I think that like teams are still going to be like, okay, so you're not like a great finisher because he doesn't have like the vertical explosion. And
right.
he just has like pretty good touch, right? Like he wasn't like awesome as a finisher in the half court. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't awesome. Like he wasn't like Tyrese Maxey was awesome at Kentucky. And I thought like, while there were flashes of awesome, Collier wasn't consistently awesome. And so teams are going to be okay if you snake a screen and you pull up at the right elbow and you're like a pretty bad mid-range shooter. And they're going to be okay with letting you, have an open shot if they go under. They might even be okay allowing you to get that advantage and make a decision knowing that you might throw the ball into the third row potentially part of the time.
The other flip side of that argument too is if you're playing a team, like let's say you're playing the Timberwolves and their whole defensive scheme against you as a point guard is we're going to let you get downhill. We're going to funnel you right into a shot blocker like Gobert. Is Collier going to have any sort of advantage necessarily in that situation? Because I think the answer is no for a number of reasons, but that's the other prong to that argument as well, right? How much of an advantage is he going to have in a situation like that?
Yeah. D. Steven in the chat says, quintessential, we want him shooting that shot guy. And that might be the case, because look, for his physical advantages at the high school level, nobody's going to stop him from getting into the paint, and finishing there. For his physical advantages, even at the college level, a lot of the times, teams are going to struggle to stop him from getting to certain spots. It's probably going to be harder in the NBA, especially as a young player. And then I think the Kings invested in De'Aaron Fox. They drafted him super high, so they gave him runway to make certain developments. If you're drafting a guy at pick 19, are you going to get that same runway to develop over the course of time that you might need to figure out the intricacies of certain things? And that I don't know. And if he doesn't get that runway, is he going to get a second chance to show that runway with another team? He'll get a second chance, but is that second team now going to look at a distressed asset and we still believe in the top tier talent? Or are they going to look at, maybe we can rehab him and he can be a role player for us, in some way. There are just a lot of questions. And I think those questions that I have with him are why I think he's super volatile as a player. He's not super duper volatile, but I do think he's pretty volatile. And I know he's getting a lot of Tyrese Maxey comps. And I think there's just so many differences with Tyrese Maxey. Tyrese Maxey missed shots because he missed the shots. Teams still weren't inviting him to shoot. They were still closing out on him. They were running him when he was flying off the floppy stuff. They were still running him to contest his shots. He was still breaking guys down and shooting these really tough off dribble jumpers. Teams weren't inviting him to shoot a ton of open shots. And he had a crazy work ethic and a crazy motor, and he was a crazy team guy, and he had all these other things. Look, I've seen him in a practice setting when he was in high school, and guys grow up and they mature. And I'm not saying that he's, he hasn't evolved and gotten better and learned how to be, more professional at USC, but he's also not a guy that I left the Hoop Summit after watching him practice for a week going, man, first guy in the gym, last guy out, he's, not to say he wasn't working hard. I'm just saying I didn't see any outlier about that. And then, he was getting hammered early in the year for his effort. So that's something he still has to learn. I don't see the Maxey stuff in the same way that I saw Maxey when he was in college. So
I will say though, Maxey, I didn't see everything with Maxey either, which is, I literally wrote for NoCeilingsNBA.com.
I know you did.
One of my biggest regrets was missing on Tyrese Maxey. But yeah, I don't see any of that with Collier. Actually, like D. Stevens said in the comments, he's more Emmanuel Mudiay than Maxey, and I can absolutely see that. I think the last thing I'll say on a prospect like Collier is I have been burned before when I'm trying to put stock into a player who relies on his brute strength to win every single matchup at the level that he's playing at, right? These guys who you can see it in high school, like you were talking about, you can see it in college, but when you get to the NBA, you're always going to be going up against someone who's bigger than you more often than not in one way, shape, or form during the course of a game. How are you then going to react to that challenge? Are you going to be able to adapt to it? I think Collier has a chance, but there are going to be some things that have to come along in his game. And it's in terms of, is that likely or not? That's exactly why we put him on the volatility index.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Who's your next guy?
So my next guy, we can keep this one fairly short and sweet, because it's for a lot of the same reasons as to why I was talking about Tyler Smith. The next guy I have is Johnny Furphy out of Kansas, 6'9" wing, 189 pounds. I also have his volatility index rating at 6. So basically the same spot I have Tyler Smith, really for a lot of the same reasons, right? If he's going to work, he's a 6'9" legit shooter off the catch. He's an athletic transition finisher, high-level finisher around the basket in general, right? He excels at attacking closeouts off baseline drives. He can finish over guys. He's not someone who is a below-the-rim finisher. He plays his tail off. He doesn't lack effort, and there's plenty of rooms where he can fill out his frame and he can get stronger. So there's a lot of appealing aspects to his game, right? He checks the spot-up box. He checks the attack-the-closeout box. He's a transition guy. He can dunk over you. But if you look at the rest of his game, there's a lot lacking, right? You can talk about his footwork defensively on the perimeter and playing pick and roll defense. You can point to a lack of handle and ball skills, right? In terms of him being able to break down defenders in non-closeout situations. He's another one of these wings who is a negative assist to turnover player. So again, we question his decision-making. How much volume can he actually handle as someone? If you put the ball in his hands, what's he going to be able to turn out? Little shot creation ability, both from 3 and from the mid-range. He only took 55 attempts at the rim. I understand he finished those at a high level, but he only got there 55 times per Bartorovic. He was 6 for 24 on non-rim twos. And we're talking about his three-point shooting being awesome off spot-ups, but almost 98% of his threes were assisted and created for him. So again, he has a defined role. He has room to grow. He has room to improve. And if that player turns out the best version of himself, that's a valuable guy in virtually any playoff situation, right? You're going to be able to find minutes for him in the rotation. Even if he's not starting, he's going to be a top 8, top 9 rotation player for you. But if enough of those other aspects of his game don't round themselves out, are we looking at a guy that's definitely going to command minutes from a coach looking for guys who are a lot more well-rounded, because that's just the skill gap in today's NBA. So I would say I could possibly revise my rating and leave a little more room for optimism, because he came on late at Kansas, right? Mm-hmm. They only asked him to do a specific number of things. And so I was very much open when I talked about him with Chuck. I don't know the answer to definitively say, can he do this? Can he not do this? I think there's definitely more to be seen. And if there are like 2 or 3 prospects I would want to be in the room for in terms of seeing him in a private workout and getting him in, if I'm a team looking to potentially draft him, he's absolutely one of those guys. I would want to put him to the test. I would want to see him against multiple other guys and actually figure out what he can and can't do, because I don't know if I have all those answers just from the Kansas tape. But because I don't have all those answers right out of the gate, that definitely points to some volatility in his stock.
Yeah, I have him out of 5 on my list as far as my ranking. Look, the defense is bad, just like straight up. But I do think there were some moments where he was like, oh, he's moving, he's competing, he's cutting guys. Like when it worked.
Because that man's got fire in his gut, man.
He plays hard and he has the tools.
Yep.
Like you said, like, put him in a pick and roll. Like he just doesn't know how to do some of this stuff yet. Like guarding a guy on an island who you kind of need to close the gap on and take away space. Like he'll give too much space. He'll play flat. He'll let the offensive player dictate the offensive possession instead of making them make a decision and using his length and his tools to kind of get in their stuff and make them uncomfortable. Like those are the things that he just doesn't necessarily know how to do yet, but I think he could be capable of. I teetered on like, should I make him a 6 kind of in a similar way, because Tyler Smith also, they're like you said, they're very similar in that way.
I'm a little more concerned though, in terms of the lack of ball skills and some of the decision-making and ability off the dribble, because Furphy is going to be a wing at the NBA level, right? Tyler Smith has a little more of an out, because he may not very well be asked to do more of that stuff just because of the position he's going to play and the role he's going to have. But it is a little more concerning for Furphy that we haven't seen some of that stuff at Kansas.
Yeah, I'm not super concerned, because I think he's stuck in that play finisher role, and I think he's fine dribbling. Like he's not a guy that I'm like, oh, the ball's going to go off his foot. You know, like he comes off a DHO, he attacks downhill, he can get to the rim in 1 or 2 dribbles. Long strides, good athletes. He'll attack a closeout. Teams will consider him a threat out there once he's established himself. And I also look at the fact that like he had to play a lot of that season without Kevin McCullough, who I think, like playing alongside of him more would really help him and what he could do. So one of my concerns though is that like, is he maybe not as good a shooter as maybe we think he might be? Because he started out super hot and then he cooled off. Yeah. And his free throw shooting, he's 77%, which is like pretty good. His form mostly looks good. He's got a quick release. It's high. But like his follow through, he's got that Amen Thompson follow through where it just like drifts off to the right instead of like pointing at his target. It's like pointing at, somebody getting a beer in the third row. But he has so many things already going for him with his form and like his touch as a shooter and like as a, like, I think he could shoot off movement and stuff, that I don't think he's going to be a bad shooter. It's just that like, again, if his shot isn't going in because he's going to struggle early on defensively, like how does he get on the floor? Like Christian Brown gets on the floor because he's going to go and try to guard Anthony Edwards and do his best and frustrate him. And even if he gets 4 points, over the course of the game, he's at least trying to make an effort defensively to take out the other team's best player. When shots aren't dropping for Furphy right now, he can't be on the floor.
I would agree 1,000%. And it is valid to question how good of a shooter really is he, because he was, I told you he was 6 for 24 on non-twos, but I looked up dribble jumpers specifically on Synergy. He was 4 of 15 on those shots. Right.
Yeah. He's clearly not comfortable, especially without a screen. If he's, it may be a 1-2 dribble pull up or whatever. It might be a little rushed. So
but
how much is
that we have in like top shooter categories though? Like they're taking those shots in more volume because they trust it, and they're also making them at a much higher clip. So I think it's fair to question. He may be a good shooter, but is he going to be a great shooter? I think there's absolutely room to question that.
Right. Now he could be a good shooter at 6'8", 6'9".
That exactly.
As a positive athlete.
Room for optimism. Yep.
So for me, that's why I have him as a 5, but I could totally see him being a 6. I just personally and also he was, 1 assist to 0.8 turnovers. Like, he's not really moving the ball. He's not turning the ball over and throwing the ball out of bounds. He's not really doing anything when the ball is in his hands outside of, dunk, layup, shoot. So,
well, that's exactly why I left some room open, right? Like to answer that question, like, is he not able to do some of that stuff? We don't know because he didn't have those opportunities necessarily at Kansas for me to definitively say.
And he wasn't supposed to be a this year guy. So like his role wasn't established as a shot creator.
Exactly.
He burst onto the scene. I like Furphy. I'm still kind of in on him as a top 20 guy, but I get why he kind of fell off, essentially. Okay. Let's hit Zach Edey.
Here we go.
Who I think a lot of people feel is maybe people don't even believe he's volatile. It might be that people are either in or out on Zach Edey.
People might be so out to where he won't even register on their volatile index. They've already made up their mind on him.
So for me, I am a believer in Zach Edey. He is a guy that we have both seen live.
Yep.
And we've gotten to, watch him live over the course of multiple years. So I have him as a 3.5 on my index.
I love it.
Because I'm pretty confident in it. I think that his statistical dominance in college is not going to translate in the same way that it did in college, but I think that his statistical dominance kind of can't be ignored at this point. And it's not like you can't be like, oh, Taco Fall was tall. And, it's like, this is not the same thing.
No.
He's much more skilled. He's bigger, or I don't know, but taller, but he's like a thicker human being. He's fiery. I love how much of an FU attitude he's developed and that chip on his shoulder. He took a team to the finals on his back. I think he is improved as a passer, even if he's not at the same level of like a Donovan Clingan. I think the fact that he can knock down his free throws at the level that he can is unbelievable. I think people don't realize that he's like a 100th percentile pick and roll finisher, if I'm not mistaken.
He's a 100th percentile creator of free throw opportunities, by the way. You mentioned how he knocks down a lot of them, but no, I guarantee none of these bigs in this draft class, I don't have the free throw rates in front of me, but I bet none of them come close to what he garnered and produced. So.
Right. And he's going to still draw fouls at the next level. He's not going to have 4 guys draped over him the same way that he had in college. I'm sure teams are going to be much more willing to single coverage. Maybe they throw a double at him every now and then. But he is definitely the kind of guy that I think is going to be able to still play his game, evolve his game into a more modern way, be effective. And then defensively, I'm not nearly as worried as some other people are. Like RK Anthony in the chat, shout out, says Edey was born in the wrong era. And while that may be true, because in a different era, he would have been the definitive number 1 pick, I'm guessing. He also, I think, can play in this era. And even if his 3-point shot never develops, I still think the fact that he knocks down his free throws at such a high rate allows him to still make, be considered a guy who can shoot it a little bit. So I think that Edey isn't super volatile because I think that he has a clear path to be an NBA player. And even if that role is in 20 minutes a night, he's still going to bring value in those 20 minutes. But I also think there are those high-level starter outcomes, that are where people will look back and be shocked and be like, wow, we really overthought the fact that he looked like his game wouldn't translate and we thought he was too big and he moved too slow. And I've kind of said that he could be like the Jalen Brunson of the draft, where like people overthought Brunson as a smaller guy. So obviously the play style is much different, but just that, like, if you looked at Brunson's statistical profile and what he did at the college level, looking back, you can't be shocked that he turned out to be the player that he turned out to be. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to be the number 1 option on, a team and take over a city like Brunson has in New York. But if he happens to be a guy who is contributing like Brunson did in Dallas as a high level guy, I'm not going to be super, super shocked. So I just think that he has a safer floor that people are being willing to give him credit. But at the same time, people are very much pessimistic on what that is like. And so his range of outcomes, if you look around the internet, his volatility, if you look around the opinions, is probably a 10. Like, it's as high as anybody's.
No, I agree 100%. I mean, when we talk about Edey, I would echo a lot of what you said. I think with him, a lot of people are concerned about the fact that when you look at his scoring and you actually break it down, we know the majority of the volume is coming from, we already talked about the free throws, but also just the fact that he was a dominant post-up heavy player in college, right? And you don't see a lot of those guys in the NBA anymore. You see a lot of, pick and roll. You see a lot of transition finishers, vertical lob threats is the big thing right now with Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford going to the finals. But what I would say to that is when you actually look at the times that he does roll to the basket, when you look at times where he has to move without the basketball and let the basketball find him, he isn't awkward as a mover, as a big man, right? He is a little more agile than he's given credit for. I don't think he has bad feet at all. I think people are getting way too hung up on the fact that a guy who's 6 foot and moves like a blur can get past him and finish at the basket. And I think that's the exclusive point that everyone's getting hung up on, right? They think he's going to be excluded. He's going to be food and drop coverage. Everyone's going to be able to score over him. He's not going to have an advantage against any of these perimeter guys. And while there are going to be some matchups that he certainly won't win, there's going to be others where he does win because he's 7'4" and 300 pounds, right? Like if you challenge, how many times are you going to be able to challenge Edey at the basket? He's not going to come away with at least a deflection on the ball, right? How many shots is he going to be able to deter? When we talk about deterrence, period, guys aren't going to necessarily want to challenge him every single drive if they don't have the right angle coming at him. So I think that like you said, he has a solidified role. He's going to give you points in bunches. He's going to give you free throw opportunities in bunches. I think there's absolutely ways in which he can expand as a passer out of double teams, passer out of the block. I think he's going to be able to evolve a little more as you move him away from the basket as like a DHO type operator. And if he does develop some kind of jump shot, which again, you talk about the touch numbers both around the basket, a little further away in the paint, his free throw numbers. If he does develop a jump shot, then I mean, we are probably looking at a starting center in the NBA, because he played 30 plus minutes a night in college, and he was playing games in the tournament like 38, close to all 40 minutes. So like at the end of the day, I think a lot of the skepticism with him is overblown. I will leave a little bit of room for some of the negative outcomes, which is why I have him 18th on my board. I don't have him as a lottery prospect, but
what's his volatile index ranking for you? What would you give him on the volatile?
For
index?
me, I'm about where you would be. I might even be lower. I might even be at like a 3 instead of like a 3.5. I think it's going to work. In terms of how much it's going to work, I think there's room to discuss that. But in terms of him being an NBA big for 10 plus years, again, barring injuries or anything crazy like that, I'm taking him in the top 20, and I'm not thinking twice about it. Depending on the team, I would think about taking him in the lottery. Yeah, I think you and I talked off air a few months ago about the Chicago fit as a possibility. I like that one. I think Portland could look at using him with a second lottery pick. I think he would make a lot of sense there, backing up Ayton, getting to learn, and then maybe eventually if they move off of Ayton, you can throw him into the starting lineup. There's places that make sense for him in the lottery, but top 20 value to me, absolutely, especially in this draft.
Yeah. RK Anthony says Edey is volatile among Thunder fans. And if he goes in that lottery, if he Ross 101, I love his fit on the Grizzlies. If he goes 9, if he goes 12 or whatever, like I could see there being a lot of differing opinions on what he could bring to a team. But I think ultimately, like, even if he goes in the top 10 at 9 to the Grizzlies, we've seen them succeed with a guy who could set such good screens and play a half court style.
We didn't even touch on that aspect of his game. How good of a screen setter he can be.
Right. Yeah. One of his best qualities. Like, you try getting hit by a 7'5", 300-pound guy. Sounds terrible. Not for me.
that doesn't sound like the kind of game that I want to be in. Can we touch on the Thunder for a very, very quick second?
Sure.
So I think there is a lot of skepticism with him possibly being a target for them, as a number of other players, because we've seen the Thunder draft guys to play a certain style, right? They want these versatile dribble, pass, shoot guys, and it seems like everyone is only mocking those guys exclusively to the Thunder now. But at some point, don't you kind of want there to be a change-up pitch somewhere on the bench where you're able to go to a different style and throw a completely different look at somebody and say, you've gotten so used to game planning around this style, we're going to throw something completely different at you. Now go try and match that. And then, oh, by the way, we have this other thing that works really well for us. We can go right back to it, not miss a beat. And we're going to find our rhythm pretty quickly, no matter what we do. Like, at some point, don't you try and change things up just a little bit in Oklahoma City?
Look, their management is too smart to be like, we are only sticking to these rules, right? Like, you can have guidelines and you can have play styles that you favor. But like you said, at a certain point, you do want the opportunity to be able to show something different.
Color outside the lines, live a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So they're too smart to take stuff like that off the table. They just are.
100%. 100%.
Okay. So who's your next guy?
All right, let's go up a little bit on the volatility index here. Okay. So I'm going to be honest. I thought about a 10 5-alarm fire with this guy, but I don't want to come on here and be known as the negative Nancy, my first time back on the No Ceilings feed. So I'm going to give him an 8, but I am very concerned about Tidjane Salaun playing for Cholet over in France.
I gave him a 9 for what it's worth.
Okay. So we're right in the same spot.
And I like Salaun, to be fair. But I can't deny how volatile he is. So go ahead.
I can't say I've watched every single one of their games, but I've watched enough. I don't get it. I'm just going to say it. I don't get it with him. He is a confident and aggressive player who very much so believes in himself. That man is not afraid to let it fly, whether he's going to make a shot or that's bricking off the backboard and he's just going to own it and take it on the chin and come down the floor and shoot the next shot the exact same way. He is confident. He's physically imposing. as a potential 4-3. He's athletic as a straight line driver / 2-foot leaper. He's a solid rebounder, and mechanically, I think he has room to grow his game in a number of areas, both in terms of shooting and defending. However, his defense is atrocious. When I watch his defense, I am not confident in a number of different aspects in him in terms of defending around the basket, in terms of defending on the perimeter, in terms of defending in the pick and roll. He's an inconsistent finisher on the offensive side of the ball. He's a poor jump shooter by the numbers. You can point to some games where he gets hot and he puts up 27 points and you're like, where did that come from? But by the numbers and the overall sample size, he's a poor jump shooter. He has
month to month is very inconsistent. It's very inconsistent.
Exactly.
Month to month.
Exactly. Poor handle to create off the bounce. And then another one of these guys who I just don't buy his passing feel at all. I don't believe in his ability right now in terms of how he sees the floor to make the next read. So I'm looking at a guy who is a play finisher. He can project as a 3-and-D forward if every single thing breaks right for him. But the game tape that I've seen, I think he's so far away from that, which is why I don't like people are mocking him top 5, top 8, top 10. Corey, I just don't get it. I don't get it. And maybe someone can explain it to me and explain it to me like I'm 5 and I'll understand. I'll be like, yeah, I get it. But the homework that I've done, and I'm not the world's greatest scout, but I've been doing this for long enough. Usually when I watch something, I can understand why people are buying in. I don't get it with him. So it seems like you're in a similar boat because you rated him 9. I rated him 8. But I don't know. Try to explain it to me like I'm 5, man. What's going on with Salaun? Yeah,
I think he might be the most volatile prospect in this class, just from the standpoint that, he like Kristen Peak, who's like awesome. And like does as much work and has boots on the ground as much as anybody in this entire space. I think he was 5th on her latest mock.
Literally, yeah. I think I saw it on Twitter like an hour before we started doing this. Number 5. Yeah.
So, and like, because I think she heard talking to people that like teams like Salaun, right? And that's why I think he's so volatile, because of where he could potentially land. The sell on that is that he's one of the youngest players in the draft. He's 18,
yep.
Right? And he has an incredible frame for like he looks huge on the court. I believe that those guys are going to get officially measured this week in Italy.
I would be shocked if he only weighs 203 pounds. I know I got that off Real GM, but there's no way he's only weighing in at that. He's got to.
No, he's strong. He's a strong, like physically. Yeah. He's got a great frame and he looks huge. Like if he comes in at 6'8", I'm going to be like, wow, really? Because I look at him and I'm like, wow, this dude 6'10", like maybe taller, like in shoes. And I think that is the sell, knowing that he has shown those flashes of play finishing. Like he's a terrible finisher at the rim when it comes to like anything that's outside of a dunk, but he dunks enough that you're like, well, he's still going to be a good finisher because he dunks the ball a lot.
Right.
The shot is I don't love the touch on it either. So like I do think that there could be reason, or maybe is reason, to be optimistic that he will be a good shooter, because I think his form is good, and when like it goes in, it looks great. But the fact that it doesn't go in all the time is definitely an issue. Other reason to be positive: he is contributing to a playoff team in a good professional league and doesn't look out of place, and he's been productive. For me, if you're like, yo, I'm the Spurs at 8. I want to draft him with my second lottery pick at 8. I think you're buying into that there is a Michael Porter Jr. type role for him. Now, Michael Porter Jr., before he had all his injuries, was, people were like, this is KD
in the world.
Yeah, this is KD, like as far as like what he could do as an off the bounce scorer. And I think that Salaun has shown a little bit of that, with like, he's got some combo moves where you're like, oh, that was pretty crazy that went in. Obviously flashes, and that's why we're talking about how volatile he could be. It's not something he's doing consistently. But if you're just looking at like giant play finisher that like is going to be able to shoot over guys, like because he's so big, he has a high release. And if the shot if he's shooting 37, 38%, God forbid he ever hits 40, you're looking at an insane asset for your team as somebody who can play off of other creators. And so you don't have to rely on him developing the on the ball stuff, because if he becomes the kind of shooter people think that he could, he won't need to develop that. And if he does, that's just gravy. And that's why you take the chance on drafting him early, potentially, because he can do that.
But the fact that his potential signature skill is still theoretical,
correct,
when we're evaluating him, that should scare the living daylights out of anyone looking at his tape.
I think it should as well. And that's why, even though there is that Michael Porter Jr. type role for him, it's also possible that he's Kevin Knox. And
I love when you said that to me when we were texting. I love that. I was like, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. And that's probably why I don't understand enough of what I'm looking at. Because I had, funny enough, I actually liked Kevin Knox as a prospect when he was at Kentucky. I think a lot of people did. Certainly at the
he went in the top
firm
10.
I was working with that back in the day. Yeah, that big reason why he went top 10. But the fact that he showed a lot, but he didn't necessarily have that one bankable thing that we could look back on and say, yeah, that was definitely going to translate at the NBA level. And the fact that he was so behind the skill curve, behind the feel curve as well, that combination, no matter the tools that you have in today's NBA, probably isn't going to bode well for you unless you go to a very specific team that has a very specific plan to bring him along. They have a clear vision as to what they think he's going to be in 3 years. And if that's the case and they carry it out, the similar type of role that you just outlined, that's great. How many teams are actually going to do that for a guy like Salaun, though, in today's NBA? We question the development that NBA teams have, behind the doors all the time. And I think that's a big thing that we discuss when we're trying to mock guys to certain situations, is who actually fits where. So if we're looking less down that avenue, what does that mean for a guy like Salaun?
Yeah. And like, I always look at going to the Kevin Knox example. Like I said in, I guess it was the 21 draft, Zaire Williams, right? That was Zaire Williams and Trey Murphy. Yep. I always said, like, why do you want to draft Zaire Williams when you can draft Trey Murphy? And like for a team, I guess you can look at this draft and be like, well, why do you want to draft Salaun when you can draft like Tristan da Silva?
Yeah.
Because, because you might just be getting the player who develops better in the similar kind of role that you want Salaun to ultimately develop into. And so it's like, if you're a lottery team that has multiple picks, maybe you take a shot, but at the same time, it's like, do you just want to potentially throw a pick away? And like with Memphis right now, we look and it's like they drafted Gigi Jackson in the second round. And that was a guy that was super volatile himself. And it's like, now it looks like, oh, Gigi was a home run. But in the context of his pre-draft season, like there were so many red flags that it was like, this could be a disaster. Right. And like, that's why teams didn't swing on him in the first round. Yeah. I don't know if there's like all that many differences between Salaun and Gigi as far as like maybe like their high end outcomes or whatever, but like also their floors, outside of the fact that Gigi had some like, personality things that people were concerned about, how real they are or not, and how much of it is he was just a young teenager. But like, is this the kind of bet you want to take in the top 10, or do you want to take a swing on this more so in the second round, where like if you miss, it's not as big a deal, and if you do hit on that talent, great. We even if we hit a double, like at the end of it, like we got the value out of it. So that's why I think he's so volatile, because like there's probably more scenarios if you played his career out 100 times that I think that he ends up not working out versus that he ends up does working out.
You and I are basically saying somewhere between 80 to 90 times out of 100, we're not getting the return that we would expect when we're making that pick on him. So
right, but if you do, but those scenarios where it does work out,
at 10 to 20, yep,
man, like that's why he's going to go high. And if this team wants to, I get the appeal of not just like, oh, we got Tristan da Silva. Like you're not going to be like running home at night to be like, I watched Tristan da Silva tonight. It changed my life, like, whereas like Michael Porter Jr., you're like, man, when this dude is on, I watched Michael Porter Jr. tonight. I can't believe what that dude was doing. So that's kind of the upside swing versus play it safe. And I kind of get it with him.
Play it safe, though. Sometimes the play it safe isn't even playing it safe. Sometimes you still hit a home run. It's like we were. I'm not saying there is a guy in this draft who's going to compare to Keegan Murray, but a lot of that was the talk about Keegan Murray. It's like you could point to some things that he did really well, some things that maybe aren't going to come around for him at a high level in the NBA. So does that cap his ceiling? But we all felt so great that we had him very highly ranked on our boards because we just felt comfortable. If we pick this guy, we know what he's going to do for our organization. We don't have to worry about him. Right. Versus these other guys like a Salaun, to where we have to help him come along in X, Y, and Z areas just for him to possibly break even in terms of positional value where the NBA is at. So,
yeah, Desmond Bane, right? Like these guys.
Desmond Bane.
Yeah, like there's a ton of these guys who have safe floors, but because they're actually able to play and develop on an NBA court and they're actually able to expand their game because they have skills they can bank on, sometimes we give them, I guess, false ceilings, right? Like,
yep.
So, but yeah, I think Salaun is super, super volatile. But the fact that people talk highly of him, he was productive, seems like he's a really hard worker. This is a guy who wasn't like touted and kind of came out of nowhere, like people knew about him, but he wasn't this guy that was expected to potentially be a top 10 pick necessarily. But there are a lot of outcomes with him, and some of those outcomes scare the living hell out of me. So yeah, if you didn't pick him, I was definitely going to pick him. All right. Let's go with Kel'el Ware.
Okay.
Because I'm interested to see where you are with Ware, because I don't remember where he was at on your board. And this is another guy, highly touted, 5-star, insane measurements, off the charts athletically at the combine. And his coach couldn't stop trashing him as a freshman because of the effort he gave. Had to get a change of scenery. A lot of opinions on this guy. I have Kel'el Ware as a 5.
Okay.
What is your volatility index ranking?
So if I were to attach a number to Kel'el, I would probably go. Let's go 5.5. I'll go slightly over you. What I will say about him, I know you're going to break down his game and your overall evaluation of him. What I will say is that you started out with the intel point. You hit that nail right on the head. That is not news to anyone who has been in this space, who has talked with scouts, executives. And if anyone didn't know that information, Gavoni put it right in one of his latest ESPN articles that you can find on ESPN Plus. So like that puts it out there. Like we're not sharing any breaking news when it comes to that. What I will say to that though, is that I have not heard those similar rumblings during his second year at Indiana. A lot of that stuff quieted down. Even Gavoni spoke to that in that same piece. So I think because those concerns existed at one point, that stuff never would leave my mind. If I'm in the chair for a team trying to make a decision on who we're drafting, that's why I would put it at 5.5. If we're talking about my comfort level with the overall talent of him as a player, that rating would diminish to where I don't think his talent level is volatile. I think he has a lot of skill. I think he has a defined role. I think he has a place where he can impact the NBA game. But if all those questions start seeping back into his evaluation, and you're starting to question that trust level, that's where a lot of the volatility can come in. And so it's, do you even want to embark down that road? Do you even want to invite yourself to embarking down that road? And that's where it would come to for me. That's why I have him at 25 on my board. If I'm ranking him, though, in terms of pure talent, you can argue he's a top 10 prospect in this class.
100%. Dirty Dancer says, if the intangibles were good, Ware would be an easy top 5 pick. He also said Ware reminds him of Christian Wood and Charlie Villanueva. D. Stevens said, reminds me of Mo Bamba. These are not names that you necessarily want to be, in the same sentence as, right? Like, no. These are guys that were all talented, that all went high. Well, some of which went, very high, and could theoretically be really productive because of their skill set, but just didn't have that extra gear that was needed to make it work at the NBA level. So like, there are a lot of opinions on Ware. I think he started to pick up steam a little bit as because of how talented he is. I talked to executives that said that, and somebody who works in the league, not multiple, that said that that they think that right now he's a better prospect than Alex Sarr.
That's an opinion that's grown on social media, by the way. There are some prominent people in the draft Twitter space who have surely shared that take as well.
So, like, you're looking at a super talented guy, right? 7'1", 7'5.5", 7'6" wingspan, whatever it was. Now, I've seen him multiple times this year, and I was never under the impression he wasn't playing hard. I wasn't looking at him like he looks like Matthew Dellavedova in the finals, where he's working so hard that, he literally needs to go to the hospital after. But I never got the impression that he wasn't playing hard when I saw him up close. I think the shot is probably further away than other people do. He shot it really well percentage-wise this year, but it was on like one attempt a game. He was a sub 70 3-point percent shooter, free throw percent shooter. He was, he didn't shoot it well last year either. The form looks okay, but he holds his hand over the ball. It's a little palmy. Like the release is a little slow. I think that's probably far away, but there is reason to believe that he could probably shoot it one day. I think he's a little bit slow defensively. He's not like an exceptional shot blocker for somebody with his traits, because I think he's a little slow to read the game sometimes. And I think sometimes his load time, he's like a little bit slow off the ground. And you compound that with the fact that he processes a little bit slower than you want, but he definitely intimidates guys around the rim, and he prevents shots from even going up. If you put him in a drop, he's good at using his length to contest, the pull-ups and play cat and mouse and all that. So, I think his passing is not, exceptional, but, he showed some stuff where it was like, okay, that was a good read, and you made a little move beforehand. And I think that, when you look at Derek Lively and his success, Ware was a guy last year where you might have been on the Ware camp. I know coming into the year, I was a little bit more in the Kel'el Ware camp, and that shifted throughout the year. But the talent is undeniable. It's just I think because of the reputation he has, and sometimes it's, unfounded, right? But I do think there are outcomes where he doesn't work as hard as he needs to. He doesn't get the playing time. He doesn't fight through the adversity, and some of the old habits maybe start popping up, and he doesn't work out based on what his talent level is.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing when you're talking about that is, if he doesn't get any better than what he is today, where do you take that guy in the draft, right? Let's just say the worst outcome for him is that he doesn't get any better. You can't necessarily say he's going to get worse, but he doesn't get any better. Is that guy a top 10 player for you? Is he a top 15 player? Or is you moving him up your board and possibly taking him near the lottery in the top 20, you're specifically banking on development that you're unsure of is going to come, period, right?
Yeah, that's the rub with him, right? I have him just outside my lottery.
Okay.
Right now. Just because mostly I'm not in love with most of the guys in this class. Fair. And in believing that they're absolutely hitting an outcome like I maybe thought with some of the lotteries in the past.
Question: who do you have higher, Filipowski or Ware?
I have Filipowski slightly higher.
Okay, so do I. And it's not that I think there's a big gap between Filipowski and Ware, but I have Filipowski at 17 on my board compared to Ware 25. And I have a bunch of other guys in between who are either Zach Edey or they're perimeter-based guys who I'm just buying into their potential projection more in terms of their role, their ability to handle the ball, what they could be in terms of secondary creators, or even in the case of a guy like Bub Carrington, who I know you're super high on. I'm not quite as super high as you, but someone who I would absolutely want to bring him into my program and be more enticed to draft him than someone like a Ware. And so that's kind of where I sit. I believe in someone like Filipowski and what he's shown through 2 years at Duke more than what Ware's shown me 1 year at Oregon and 1 year at Indiana, right? Because for all of Filipowski's warts, and I know that we're not necessarily talking about him today, but for all that we can pick apart his game, I still think he's shown me a lot more consistency than someone like Ware over a 2-year sample size. And that's why there would be, not that I think there's a big gap in between them in terms of players, but why there's a spot gap between the two of them on my board.
I do think they're different players, though, in the sense that, like, for me, like, I think Filipowski is, I don't think he's a full-time 5, and Ware can only play 5. Filipowski, I think, is a 4-5. Like, to me, like, to really succeed, he has to be the guy who is a 4. And I have him.
I'm just talking in terms of, like, big men, right? Because sometimes when you say that one big man is this spot on your board, but another one is, like, all the way down here, people will ask the question, well, why do you think there's such a big gap between them as players? And you made a great point. They're not necessarily the same player. That's not always the case, though. It's that sometimes you might be enticed to make a bet on someone else, and that's why you have a gap between them in your board. It's not that you actually think that Kyle Filipowski is worth, 8 more draft picks before you get down to someone like Ware. That's the point that I was trying to make.
Well, I guess the conundrum with Ware, and you could do this obviously with a ton of prospects, right? It's like, let's say Ware never gets better, like you said. Is that worth drafting in the spot that it'll take to draft him, where he's really just like a lob threat, kind of okay shot blocker who hits a 3 occasionally, but you have to worry about if he's going to play hard all the time, and you have to draft him at 12 or 17 or 9 versus like looking to get a guy like a Dembona who has an insane motor, and you might be able to get at 42, who can do a lot of the same things with much less risk if Ware never gets better. Now you're drafting Ware ahead of Bona because the threat that he might shoot it and he might turn into Brook Lopez. And if that happens, he's one of the most valuable prospects in this entire draft. But the reason that we're even talking about him as potentially a guy who can go at 9 or 12 or 27 is because sometimes that intel stuff, even if it improves 1 year to the next, it might not be enough for a team to be fully confident. And if you go to 27, you might not get that same developmental runway that you would get if you're drafted in the top 10 necessarily. And even if you are drafted in the top 10, you might not get that runway if things start slow. Looking at a guy like Jackson Hayes, right? Who so there's that's why the draft is hard.
That's exactly why the draft is hard. That's why the draft is volatile. That's the whole point of this podcast. You said it. You said it excellently. I don't have anything to add off what you said.
So your next guy is?
My next guy is Yves Missy out of Baylor.
Okay.
Someone who I actually do like him a lot, but I have him ranked way lower on my big board, and I mocked him way lower than I thought I would about 2 months ago. And it's not because I don't see some of the special that's a part of his game, right? Like I wrote down, he is potentially the most versatile on-ball defender in this entire draft class. There is a world in which that is in play for him. He is an elite positional athlete in terms of his speed, agility, verticality, his footwork. He's a really good at-rim shot blocker. But he's not an elite finisher offensively. He's shown us nothing outside of 3 feet away from the basket. He still needs to add on. He was listed at 229 pounds, but he definitely needs to get stronger, not just bigger. He has little to no passing feel right now. He is strictly a dunker or a lob guy or a cleanup guy. He doesn't have a post game. And he's still developing a lot of his awareness and his feel off the ball, right? Both offensively and defensively. So the raw tools and the raw package is incredibly enticing to the point where I had him as a potential lottery guy a few months ago. But I've had to look back and say, well, there's a number of areas in which he's going to be relied on to produce in as a center that he wasn't good at. He wasn't an elite level rebounder. I don't think he was as good of a shot blocker as I would like him to be. He wasn't as good of a finisher as I would like him to be. And if those things don't come along for him and he's not able to play to his strengths as a big man, then why is he going to earn minutes on the floor that you would want him to if you take him in the lottery or you take him inside the top 20? Why would he play those minutes? Because those other things that I'm raving about away from the basket and how he can be versatile on the defensive end on the ball, that's not going to matter if he's not doing all the other big man stuff that he needs to do at a high enough level. So that's, I think, where a lot of the skepticism comes in. That's why I have him rated as a 5 on my volatility index. You could talk me in the higher, you could talk me in the lower. I kind of went middle of the road because I can see an excellent outcome for him, but I can also see to the point where if he doesn't develop in a number of these other areas, and again, we're talking about a league where we're questioning a lot of the development for these guys league-wide. If he doesn't develop, then why is he getting on the floor more than a lot of these other guys that you can draft ahead of him? And so that's where, as much as I've wanted to be a fan of his, I've also had to kind of look at it, as much as I want to look at it glass half full, I've had to look at it glass half empty and be a skeptic. I don't know where you're at on Missy right now. That's kind of my conundrum.
7.
Okay.
A 3% assist rate is insane. 3% assist rate's insane. And then 11% turnover rate or whatever it was for somebody who's like a complete play finisher.
Not great.
It's not great. And it's scary.
Yeah.
So you touched on a few things. Obviously, look, no one is going to deny he's a physical specimen, and that matters, and that's important. And I was actually a little surprised that he ended up being like at the combine. I think he's like a legit 7-footer with shoes. So that's great. He's not one of these guys who's like 6'8.5", and like is so
Sure.
He's got legit size. But like, people are going to look at Derek Lively and be like, "This, we need to draft the next Derek Lively, a guy who provides rim gravity and is a play finisher and the shot blocker and defender." And
which, by the way, I know you're going to break into like the actual aspects of his game as to why that's unfair, but it's an unfair comparison from the start purely because Lively's been a decorated prospect for a number of years, and Missy started playing basketball, like real competitive basketball, like 3 years ago. So like right off the bat, it's an unfair comparison, but I know where exactly you're going to go.
Yeah. And like, you need that time when you're super raw to like get these reps. And Lively has always been an awesome like passer. And like he may not be coming off pick and rolls and dissecting a defense, but his processing when he's coming off of a short roll has always been there. And like, that's why even though he was unproductive from a like box score watching number for a lot of the year last year at Duke, his advanced stats were really, really good.
Yeah.
And he was still making an impact on the court because he was doing it in all these different ways. So the processing, I think, is the big differentiator, because with Lively, like, it's now you have to come up and tag him higher, right? Because you're afraid that he's going to be a guy who's protecting the rim. But with these tags, like, he can now hit the corners.
Yep.
And hit shooters and find guys on the floor, and you don't have to worry about him making a bad decision out of that, right? Like, if somebody comes and tags higher up, you're not going to dip your shoulder in and get a charge. Like, he's going to have the wherewithal to understand the spacing and have that spatial awareness to make those reads in a way that like Missy doesn't have yet. And I think NBA defenses are sophisticated enough that they're like going to figure out a way to, okay, this dude is going to, he needs to be a lob threat. Like, we can play this a little bit easier than you can with a guy like Lively, who, even though his game is simplified, there's a lot of nuance to it.
Correct.
And I don't think that Missy has the nuance offensively. I also don't think he has particularly good hands. There are some games where he's like, just, you throw the ball up and, he's bobbling the ball and whatnot. And like, yeah, okay, he's only played for X amount of years, but like, if you're going to go in the NBA, it doesn't matter how many years you've played. You're playing against the best players in the world that they don't care about this anymore. You could be enticing and there's this and that, but you're a used, like, prospects are like used cars. Once you're driven off the lot, it doesn't matter, where you were picked. You're either playing or you're not. You can either play or you can't.
So that's the thing, right? Is like when we would discuss some of these incredibly raw prospects, not even that long ago, it's called like 2 or 3 drafts ago. And you told me that someone was already this productive and he'd only been playing competitive basketball for 3 years. I'd be like, awesome, sign me up, especially with his tools. I'm going to take this guy top 10 no questions asked. But now you look at where the skill gap is in today's NBA. Now all of a sudden you're looking at it from the opposite angle to where, oh, he's this far behind the curve. How am I going to get him on the floor to get minutes so that he can actually get better at all of these things? If I can't get him on the NBA floor in somewhat significant minutes within his first 2 years of playing, all of a sudden we're staring down the barrel of him in year 3, looking at potentially either we're going to have to extend him in like a year and a half, or we're going to have to move off of him. Like, that's why a lot of these guys aren't going as high as you may think if you're just purely watching the highlights or you're just watching some of the games on tape, is that these are the decisions that NBA general managers and personnel actually have to walk themselves through and think about. And I'm glad that, I think the discussion has definitely shifted more towards that way in the draft space over the last few years, which is great, by the way. I'm glad that we have a lot of people thinking like that, because I think it's important for viewers and listeners. But that's why we have higher levels of volatility with someone like this. Not that we don't believe in them. It's just the position that general managers and executives are going to be in. It's a very difficult one, I think, more so than ever with someone like Missy.
No, 100%. Being raw, you can only be raw for so long until, people move on. But the other thing too, like, if your main skill is like, and look, he clamped Kyle Filipowski. He is a super versatile defender, like you said. Like, he could do way more than block shots. But like, he's not an elite shot blocker either. Like, I think when I look at like block percentages, like all the elite guys are like hovering around that 10% mark.
They're double digits. Yep.
Like Evan Mobley was like 8.8. So, but you just knew that this is a dude who was such a good, impactful defender that like he's right in the ballpark and he does so many things well, and how he read the game. But like most of these guys are like the double digit block percentage. So anytime I see a guy whose main calling card is shot blocking and then they're in like the 6 to 8 range, I'm like a little skeptical. Like, that would 6%, 6.5%, 7. It's great for a wing, but it's not exactly great for like a shot blocking center who that's one of their main calling cards.
And also the finishing around the basket too, right? Like when we talk about some of these guys, like these elite rim runners in the NBA who have found a home doing that, like a Rob Williams is like 70+% from the field, and his true shooting percentage is almost sky high off the charts. Missy's only at 62%. I do think a big part of what plays into that is exactly what you talked about with him bobbling the ball and some of the catches, right? He's not clean catching. It doesn't have the best of hands. But if you aren't not only an elite shot blocker, but you also aren't an elite finisher at the basket, it becomes much more difficult for me to make an argument for you to get minutes, especially if you're not contributing in all these other areas. So that's another area where you would want to see more. It's not that he was bad, but he wasn't at that level to where he's up there with some of the guys that are actually playing that role in the NBA.
Yeah, 100%. All right, so I'm up.
Yeah, you're up.
Correct?
I think we're on our last guys.
I got 2 more.
You got okay. You got 2
You
more.
have 1. Yeah. So we can bang through this one pretty quick. Cody Williams.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cody Williams, Colorado. Is gonna be a 6'7", 6'8" wing in shoes. Actually, he came in, like, obviously he's not like super bulky like Jalen is, but he came in a little bit lighter than I thought he was going to. Had a very up and down year. There were times where he was being mocked as a number 1 pick. Now people are questioning whether or not he's going to be a lottery pick. So there's a lot of volatility in how people feel about him. He shot 40% from 3, but he did it on super low volume. He was awesome as a finisher at the rim. His touch there was pretty crazy. Didn't, for somebody who's like 6'8" and pretty athletic, didn't rebound at the level you need him to. Had an NBA scout go like, what does he do on the floor? like what does he do when he's out there? He kind of, in high school, you looked at him as a guy who maybe was going to make some plays with the ball in his hands as a passer, and he showed some flashes of passing ability, but didn't do it consistently. His handle isn't like super high level to where you think he can break down guys off the bounce consistently in like isolation. So he has question marks to his game. And I see why people have that. I have him as a 5. Okay. I'm pretty solid on Cody. I might even have him as a 4. Like, I like Cody. I would have
put him at a 4. Yeah.
Yeah, I still have him as a pretty easy top 10 guy for me. I even though the volume was low, I think the mechanics are fine. I think he has good touch indicators on his shot. I definitely have my concerns, but I think that he's going to be a guy who defends multiple positions. He's going to have to learn to, play with some force. And when we saw him at the Hoop Summit, that was the thing that we questioned. We're like, he doesn't really make himself stand out in anything. He's kind of okay being around the background. And being the third option at Colorado, he could get away with that. And that ultimately could be his role at the next level. So maybe it won't matter all that much. But you want him to be, more active, making defensive plays. You want him, as Cosmo says, rebound, steal rate, block rate, stuff like that. You want that to be more impactful. You want him to use the tools that he has more than maybe he does at times. But at the same time, when he tailed off, he was coming back from injury. He dealt with multiple different weird injuries this year. So I'm kind of okay with where he's at, but I get why people might be scared off on what he could or will be.
So I've talked with some scouts who would argue with me to the death that this guy is not the top level prospect that he's been billed as coming into this process. And I think a lot of the skepticism with him is fair. You did a good job at outlining what a lot of that skepticism is. I think where I point to optimism with Cody, he was one of these late growth spurt guys, right? So he was like a 6'1" guard up to a certain point. I think around his junior year of high school, I want to say. But he went through like a crazy growth spurt. And all of a sudden now he's 6'8", 6'9". That I don't remember what he measured in at the combine specifically, but he's much taller. He's much longer.
I think it was like 190.
Okay. So to your point, the lack of physicality, the lack of force, the lack of playing like he's someone who's 6'8", 6'9" in the court, I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that he was this late growth spurt guy who's still trying to figure out his body. He's still trying to figure out what he can and can't do. You do see some of those guard skills shine through when he's driving to the basket, when he is breaking somebody down. You talked about the jump shot. I know it was low volume, but the touch seems good from other areas on the floor, and he did shoot 40%. So I think I'm buying into that part of his game. But my biggest question with him, it's a place where you can point to some optimism, because if he does grow into the fact that, yeah, I'm a forward, I'm not a guard anymore, I can rebound, I can crash the glass, I can reach up over guys, I can block shots. If he feeds into all that, that even bodes well for his NBA prospects. But that attitude, right, that relentlessness, I won't even necessarily call it motor, but you can call it motor, but that realization that he's not a guard anymore, is that something that you develop? I guess would be my biggest question mark for him. We've seen guys who go through the late growth spurt, like the most prominent example we could point to is like an Anthony Davis, right? Anthony Davis figured out really quickly, I'm a massive man. I'm going to block all these shots. I'm going to be a paint presence. I'm going to do all of these things. And then, oh, by the way, when I'm put in a position to where I can lean back on some of the guard skills, I have these tools in my bag too. And that's why you see this complete player who's an all NBA, potential MVP caliber player when he's all healthy, right? Is that
or
something
how about Cody's brother, Jalen?
How about Jalen Williams? Yeah, exactly. So I guess is that something that we're going to see him develop? Is that something that can be developed? I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but that's the biggest thing I want to see, is when he gets with an NBA staff, someone who's able to open up his hips a little more, someone who the staff is able to make him a little more flexible so he can get lower in his stance, he can cover better on the perimeter. We know how he's able to get his hand on shots and play passing lanes and do all that stuff. Will he be more comfortable actually playing more like a forward, or is he just going to be stuck in this guards mentality and we don't see his game evolve more to where he's at now in terms of positional size?
I also think, and I don't think, be like, oh, he's Jalen Williams is his brother, so like he's like J-Dub. I don't think there's much you could take about the comparisons to their game, because their games are super different. But I think the one thing you can look at is like Jalen's really developed his body, and like,
oh yeah,
you can't necessarily say that Cody is going to develop in the same way, because like he's longer, he's skinnier, he's taller. But like Cody has a good frame. He's got broad shoulders. And like if he does work hard, I think there's a lot of room for growth with his body that also might help some of those things, to where he maybe is playing a little less finesse than he does now, and he can be a little bit more physical. Like instead of doing that thing where he feels the defender on his drive and he does that spin on his way to the hoop, like maybe he dips his shoulder into their chest and like moves them off their spot. And look, there's no way to know if that'll happen, but there's potential for it to happen based on, we've seen how his brother, and, I think genetically, like you can make that comparison that like there's a chance that he develops in a similar fashion. But the other thing I'll say about Cody, which is why I'm not as worried about him, is that I don't think Cody takes stuff off the table. And I think that as a prospect, if you are on the floor and you're taking stuff off the table, even if some of your higher end outcomes or you're more productive by the numbers or whatever, and when we get to my last guy, this might, relate to him a little bit. Yeah. I think that actively hurting your team on the floor is something that could be like a little underrated in how you look at top players. Cody, I don't think really takes things off the floor.
No, that's completely fair. Yep.
Yeah. So I personally don't think he's super volatile, but I think the reasons we laid out are why, he went from the guy who's number one to now like maybe he gets out of the lottery, right? And he drops a little bit. I think I saw him go to the Lakers in a mock. So, there's a wide range of outcomes, even if personally I don't think he's super volatile. I would if I was a team with multiple picks in this draft, I definitely wouldn't let him get out of my lottery. And there's a few teams that have multiple picks. All right, your last guy.
My last guy, we'll go pretty quick through him because I do want to spend some time with your guy. You really did save the best for last. Malik Lewis, who played for the Mexico City Capitanes in the G League, 6'8", 209-pound wing. I have his volatility rating as a 7, and that's probably why he's slated to go mid to late second round, more so than even a potential late first round pick, someone who a team would feel comfortable taking a flyer on. Listen, he's developing real shooting touch as a spot-up threat. He's a strong finisher at the basket for a wing. He's an athletic and long defender capable of covering multiple positions, solid positional rebounder, and he can impact the game on both ends in a variety of ways. So you put that package in a 6'8" body and you go, why is your volatility index rating a 7, Nate? Sounds like you actually really like this guy. Why wouldn't you take him in the first round? To me, it comes back to the fact that he lacks a true standout skill or role offensively, right? I don't think he's a good passer. Inconsistent results in terms of his own shot creation and rim pressure. Another one of these guys who's still developing feel and awareness defensively, both on and off the ball. So while he could bring a number of things to the table, he could even be pretty good at some of these things. I can't point to any one particular thing today that I'm going to say, yep, he's definitely going to do this on an NBA floor tomorrow, which is why I'm going to take him potentially in like the late first round, where a team could look at him and go, he produced in the G League. He's only going to be 19 years old. There's plenty of runway for somebody like him to impact the game down the line, even in a playoff setting. I'm going to take a flyer on this guy. I just think that flyer is much better suited on someone mid to late second round. And if you're taking someone that far back in the draft, or once you're in that territory, you're technically in play to not even be drafted at all. I don't think that's going to happen with Malik Lewis, but you're technically in play for it. You probably can't have him at like a 2 or a 3 on your volatility index, right? There's got to be something that's pushing it in the other direction. So these guys who need these longer developmental runways, they don't have a signature skill to bank on. That's why I would have him a little more volatile, even though despite what my ranking on a board could be, for example, I do actually like him as a prospect. I know Maxwell did a great write-up for him for no ceilings. I would take a chance on him in the second round. You can't just get me to buy in before that with someone like him.
I think that's completely fair. I didn't even know how to rank him, to be completely honest, because, he's, I think, as
I guess
far
if
as
you don't have him very high on your board, you can technically not have him as volatile because you just don't have a strong opinion on him. But
right, like, because all the other guys that we talked about today, while some of them I'm sure will fall into the second round, maybe a few of them have the shot at least. Like, I can't really foresee a world in which I'm like, oh, Malik Lewis definitely getting a guaranteed first round contract. And I think I get the appeal just based on tools, because it's a wings league, and like if you're a wing, I think inherently you have an advantage over, you know, a guy like, I don't know, KJ Simpson is 6'1", you know, with shoes on, and like he was so productive, and I love KJ Simpson, but like if he doesn't work right away, I don't know how many chances a guy like that gets.
KJ Simpson's gonna get. Yep.
You know, but at the same time, like I watch Malik Lewis, and every time I watch him, I'm like, okay, I guess he's there. Yeah, he's fine. You know, he never, like you said, he doesn't have a standout skill. There was never any time where I was like, oh, that was really fun. You know, and maybe part of that, like he wasn't with the Ignite where he was like getting some more runway to do different things. Like obviously it's still the G League, and you know, he's going to get chances to do some stuff with the ball in his hands, but he wasn't necessarily like the star of a team. You know, he's a role player.
Wasn't terrible either, though, right?
He was not.
Like Mexico City was not setting the world on fire in the G League, but his net rating was only negative 1.5. And you may say, well, Nate, his net rating was still a negative. A lot of 19-year-olds' net rating would be negative in the G League. But the fact that his was close enough to 0 on a team that wasn't setting the world on fire, it means he certainly wasn't doing a lot to necessarily bring the team down. He just wasn't this exceptional high-level player or prospect like you're kind of alluding to where we're all of a sudden going to rank him super high on our boards. I do think, though, it's noteworthy that he produced. He was efficient in a number of areas. And I think if you're getting that type of player in his frame at 19 years old, you do draft that guy. You take him, just maybe not as high as you could potentially talk yourself into.
Yeah, at the end of the day, like he's not super exciting, right? Like, yeah. Right. Look, I went to college in the Northeast, and you know, in the winter, it wasn't that exciting to walk around the quad. You know, a lot of Uggs, a lot of big baggy sweatshirts.
I didn't know where that was going, but fair enough.
Things got way more exciting when the weather started warming up, and you know, people are out on the grass with their blankets and they're tanning, and you know, like people are throwing a frisbee around. Things were a lot more fun. So he's just not very exciting. You know what I mean? Like, so it doesn't mean that there's not good stuff underneath everything, but you know, like it's just not. It might not be that exciting. So for me, that's why he wasn't.
I don't know, man. Maybe choose a better. I don't know if painting the picture of him as a winter in the Northeast is the best metaphor, but I see where you're going. Yeah. This is why I miss these podcasts, man. Miss you guys.
But I know that like you were somebody who was very dialed into the G League this year, and you know, like I think that's something you're passionate about. We'll talk about it a little later. So I think bringing him up as an intriguing guy who was a prospect in the G League, who wasn't a part of the Ignite program, is definitely an interesting call out there. Sticking in the G League, my last guy on the volatility index, and I'm sure that if anybody's still watching in the chat, and there's a lot of people watching, whether on YouTube or on Twitter/X, so shout out to everybody watching. If you're on YouTube, make sure that you like and subscribe now before I get into this next segment. My last prospect that I have, G League Ignite, Ron Holland.
Oh boy.
And I have him as an 8.
I would probably have him at like a 7 or a 7.5. Very, very close.
Okay.
Very close.
Interesting. Cause I didn't study your board for this reason. Cause I think a lot of people are very, very high on Ron.
So two things can be true though, right? Like, so sure. I have him 6th on my board, right? So two things can be true.
So you're very high on Ron Holland.
I want to buy into him like right outside that top 5, but that doesn't mean I don't acknowledge that there is a very real world at which he is not the prospect everyone's billing him as a top 3 or a top 5 guy.
Yeah. And it's very hard for me to completely buy into this kind of can't miss wing. And I think that he gets talked about as a guy who like this lockdown defender, and he gets talked about as like a freak athlete. And I think that his defense is like really good when he locks in, and he's great. We're very good at like, defensive event creation. You know, he's like got good steal and block numbers. Awesome rebounder.
He's a chaotic defender.
He's a chaotic defender.
He's a chaotic defender. defender. Yeah.
but like inconsistent effort at times, which maybe goes back to like the Tyler Smith conversation that we had. Not always great at like being consistently down in his stance. Like I think relies on that athleticism a little bit. I think he's billed as like this guy who consistently plays hard, and like he does make hustle plays. He'll dive out of bounds and stuff like that, which I like. But I don't think that like making those hustle plays necessarily always means that you're playing hard 100% of the time. And then I think he takes stuff off the table when he's on the court. Like I think that if you view him as like maybe he could be Jaylen Brown, because I think that I've talked about this before, like Jaylen Brown at Cal was kind of a disaster, like at times. But there was a lot of flashes that you can buy into that if he made it to the right developmental situation and he put all those tools together, he would turn into what he has, which is somebody that might be a major contributor on a title team.
So what the Jaylen Brown thing is interesting, and I've definitely shared the story on the podcast feed before, but in case anyone hasn't heard it, when I was doing evaluating for that draft class, I had a connection at Cal who was a reporter. He was one of the Rivals guys, sharing me details about what he would see at practice for Jaylen Brown. And while Jaylen Brown didn't have the point guard role that he played during games at Cal, he played that position a ton in practice, which said to me that they clearly believe that he has a higher ceiling, that he's necessarily always getting a show at Cal, that he has the wherewithal to process things, read things on the floor. Every indication that you got from him in interviews is that he was a very bright kid, and he's done more than that to prove that at the NBA level.
He was at Cal.
He was. That's right. He was at Cal. So there were indications that I had behind the scenes to where he's got a lot more that he's working with under the table than he was necessarily able to show during a game. I do not see those indicators for Ron Holland, right? Like I don't think Ron Holland is running the show for the Ignite in practice all the time. You saw him with Ignite in certain opportunities. He looked awesome when he had the ball in his hands, but there were plenty of other times where if you put him at the top of the floor expecting to make everything easier for everyone else, he is not that guy. And that is a big difference between those two guys. Even though Jaylen was viewed as a rawer prospect coming in, not everyone had him top 3 on their boards. I don't, as someone who saw behind the curtain a little bit, I don't see those types of things for Ron Holland in his immediate future.
Yeah. And like, I think, the Ron was the type of prospect who, when he was coming up and, he was playing off of like an Anthony Black or whatever, and he was this hustle guy who does the little things, that's a completely different player than he's kind of evolved into, where he's evolved into this guy who wants to be that guy who plays with the ball in his hands, and he wants to be the guy who is creating shots, by busting out a bunch of combo moves and getting into the teeth of the defense and all of that stuff. And like the decision making, and that's just like, not even considering that like he shot like 24% from 3 or something like that, like he's just not a good, like he's a pretty terrible shooter at the moment. But it's like the fact, some of the shots that he was taking, some moments with passes that he made or he didn't make playing with the ball in his hands, pulling up in transition for 3 on like 2-on-1s or early in the shot clock. I mean, there are just a number of things consistently driving into like 3 or 4 guys, like trying to get into tight spaces, just drawing charges in that way, where like I think truly efficient guys who can play with the ball in their hands, they're not trying to barrel through guys. Like even Isaiah Collier, who is like a downhill bully ball guy, he's not doing that like through 3 guys. Like he's still like snaking screens and trying to play into space first and then using that burst to get to where he wants to go. Like Ron is so straight line that he's just trying to go directly through you, and he doesn't have the counters when he's walled off. Like he can't read the help. Like if you talk to point guards, and I've been breaking down film with a lot of guys, or you talk to guys who are plus passers, they will tell you that they're not reading the guy in front of them. They're reading the backline help. That's who they're paying attention to, because the great players are going to be able to break guys down one-on-one. And it seems like for Ron, he doesn't know how to read how the defense is going to react based on the decision that he makes. And that's when he's going downhill. You know, like, to me, he relied so much on getting out and scoring in transition. And like, it's not an abnormal amount that he gets out in transition if you were to compare him to like a Josh Green or something, you know? But like, the fact that he's relying on that much as like his primary like way to score is also a little scary. With the shooting, for as confident as he is at times as a shooter, shooting shots he probably shouldn't be taking, then there are times where the ball swings his way and he's open for the catch and shoot three, and he like pump fakes it, takes a dribble, and then the guy closes out and then he shoots it. You know, so there are just like these feel indicators that I just don't see there with him. And like, I know and I understand how productive he was in the G League, but like, we've seen how long it takes for some of these G League Ignite guys to come into the league and figure it out. And I'm not sure how many of them have even figured it out. And I'd say most of those guys are better prospects in my eyes.
Well, he's going to be back in the G League next year. I don't think he's going to play a lot of NBA minutes. Yeah. Yeah,
undoubtedly, you know? So like, I'm just concerned with like, okay, he goes fourth to the Spurs, and it's like, all right, that's the expectation there. And if he just ends up being Keldon Johnson, then you burnt your pick. You know, and like, that's maybe a pretty likely outcome in that scenario. Like,
did you burn your pick if he's Keldon Johnson in this draft? Would be my question. In this particular draft, did you burn your pick? I'm not sure you set it on fire in this draft, but I see where you're going.
Depending on what else you could get. So, but that's also if he's willing to be Keldon Johnson again. Is he willing to scale back? Because if he's willing to scale his game back and be the guy he was more in high school, where again, a lot of what he was doing is because he was bigger and more athletic than these guys in high school. If he's willing to just commit to that, I do think there's a path where he could be impactful if he just commits to being a maniac, hustle, defender, rebounder. Even if the shot never comes around, I still think, you know, maybe he could be an interesting kind of swing energy guy who, if you have enough shooting around him, you know, don't necessarily, it doesn't kill you. But like, if he doesn't commit to that, I think that he could just bust out completely. And if he wants to be like a ball creator wing, I just don't know. And I think it's hard when you get to that point to scale your game back and come to that acceptance, you know. And like, I was listening to the interview with Kevin O'Connor, you know, and I think coming away from that, I was like, all right, he's, you know, seems like a good kid. You know, I've spoken to him a little bit. He was very respectful, all that. But at the same time, like, you know, Kevin asked him about his shot, and I get being confident, but he was like, you know, if you go back and look at my shots, you know, the misses were good misses. And it's like,
no, they
not
weren't,
sure.
But
Not sure I fully agree. So like, you know, you also have to, I don't know where his self-awareness is on that end. And I'm just a little bit concerned because I think the NBA is so much about feel at this point. And I think he's so far behind on the feel thing. You know, I don't think he's quick to make the one more, even in a more simplistic sense. You know, like, all right, he might have a couple of passes that ended up like looking like nice or whatever, but like most of the time I left really either underwhelmed or just straight up going, man, I can't believe that he made that pass, or he tried to fit the ball there, or he didn't make that pass or whatever. Like, I was just way more discouraged on him. I get if a team thinks that they can hone in his skills and get by on his raw talent, but like, I try to look at this as not a how is he the best wing in the class or whatever. It's like, how many wings can he compete with in the NBA? Like, where is he going to be ranked among wings in the league? And there are so many good wings. And like I've mentioned this before, even in last draft, I just don't think does he go before Cam Whitmore in last draft? And I know Cam had like red flags, you know, like, and that was part of why he dropped.
Sure.
I just don't know. The chat's on fire. Albert Gim, my co-host, joining late. Really great comment there. Top 3 Amish restaurants in Allentown, PA.
I can't help you with that one, Albert. I'm sorry. I can't help you with that one.
Dirty Dancer says, I don't get why people give Modest a pass on the same stuff. Look, if you were talking to me in particular, I absolutely do not give Modest a pass on the same stuff. I'm very concerned about Modest as well. Modest being billed as like a Franz type of prospect by a lot of people. Has never had a positive assist to turnover ratio at any level that Synergy is tracked. Shooting has been wildly inconsistent and very much in line with where he was this year. So I personally am not a Modest guy either, although I know Nate is. But I think that Ron is way more volatile as a prospect than a lot of people want to admit. And it makes me nervous if a team is selecting him too high. Like, he got mocked to Chicago, spoiler alert, in the No Ceilings mock that's coming out on Friday. And I was like, that might be the thing that makes me stop watching the Bulls.
Oh, I knew this was going to get bad. I was waiting for it. I'm like, all right, there it is. All right.
And I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I would never be happier than being publicly wrong like this. And I would love for people to throw this in my face. Like, I truly hope I'm wrong.
So your skepticism is warranted. I think there are certainly people on draft Twitter who have him in the top 5, top 3. They may even have him number 1 overall, who would try to throw a lot of it back at you and say that it's a little unwarranted, a little unfair. There is a part of this argument to where I saw someone say in the chat he will potentially have played 3 different roles in 3 years between his senior year in high school, Ignite, and then whatever he's going to be asked to do with his next NBA/G League team. And that's a completely valid argument to where he hasn't been given a clear runway for development. And I know they're 2 different players. They play 2 different positions, but once upon a time, Marvin Bagley fell in the same camp, right? Marvin Bagley was an incredibly productive player at Duke. Ron Holland, for all of the warts that he did show in his game, was still G League Ignite's far and away most productive player on a permanent basis when he was actually playing with the team. But he didn't have a clear pathway for development. Marvin Bagley didn't have a clear pathway for development. Nobody actually had a solid plan in place on how to bring him along. And all of that physical talent sort of fell to the wayside. And unfortunately, I could see something very similar happen for Ron Holland. Now, I am comfortable with the player that he is now in terms of just a very narrow, defined role and how he can impact an NBA game, with optimism that if he's given a clear runway for development, some of these other negatives can come along. But if he's not given that defined path, everything can go sideways, because the NBA is going to require him to do a little more than just finish at the basket as an athlete. And oh, by the way, if we're talking about percentages, he didn't technically do that at an elite level either. He was productive. He filled the box score stats. But if we're talking about overall efficiency, even the thing that he was viewed to be the best at, he wasn't an elite finisher at the basket either.
53% in the half court.
That's not going to get it done, given that that's his most bankable skill right now. So again, I have optimism about Ron. I do see ways in which he can impact the NBA game potentially right away, fully acknowledging he's probably going to spend more of his time next year in the G League, because if Jarris Walker couldn't get NBA minutes, I understand where the Pacers ended up, but if he couldn't get a lot of NBA minutes, I know you and I are 1,000% way more in on Jarris than we would be Ron Holland. So if that's the case, then I don't have a lot of optimism for his NBA role next year, but I do at least see a path to where he can do X, Y, and Z in which he can contribute. But in terms of branching his game out from there, you know, if an NBA team's drafted him to be this ball dominant wing, they're going to have their work cut out for him in terms of actually developing him into that player. If you're just going to utilize him as a play finisher, that can get you production, but is drafting play finisher Ron Holland more valuable to you than potentially taking a swing on another archetype that might be even harder to find, that might command even more salary on a second contract, to where if you're getting that type of player in a 4-year rookie deal, is that player worth more for your pick than what one of Ron Holland's outcomes might be given the tape that we've seen? And I'm sure that's the question a lot of NBA teams are asking right now. And I think a lot of people want to be a lot more optimistic with him, but that skepticism that you and I have both shared, that's something that needs to be weighed, I think, a little more in the draft space than it is right now.
And here's the other thing, going back to what I mentioned earlier about Cody not taking stuff off the table. Okay, let's look at the top 5. Because Ron takes stuff off the table. When things are bad, they're bad. Atlanta, playing off Trey, DeJounte, right? All right, well, he's not going to take the ball in his hands. And, you know, like, he could just be that play finisher. But Atlanta wants to compete. They lucked into the number 1 pick. They didn't finish at the bottom. They were able to jump 9 spots to get the number 1 pick. They want to get back into the playoffs, most likely, as long as Trey is there. So they're not going to play young guys who take stuff off the table, right? Like Jalen Johnson, they took the long view on him and developed him, and he's come around. Also, the fit there with the lack of shooting in that front court
is very worrisome. Yep.
Is worrisome. So is there a role for him in Atlanta? Hard to say.
There
Washington
can be, but it may just not be as valuable as what you would want the number 1 pick to be. Yes.
Correct. Washington. They have 47,000 wings. Not many of which are great shooters. Outside of like Kispert, right? And Denny's improving, but like, you know, first of all, I don't see how he gets on the floor over a Denny, a Kuzma, a Kispert, a Bilal.
Yeah, I'm certainly not taking him over Bilal.
You know, I just don't think the fit there is very good. I don't think there's an avenue for minutes, and I get it. Like, oh, well, we don't have to be married to Kispert and Den and all these guys, but like, okay, sure. And also, then you don't have anybody to help set him up in that role. And now he's again like he might have more runway to be bad because Washington, I don't think, is in a rush. But it's tough to see an avenue there. Houston, I just straight up think like Amen and Cam and Tari Eason.
Yeah.
You know, they're just better versions of what you want Ron to be, and he doesn't solve any of their issues.
Honestly, so is Jalen Green to an extent, right? Like,
sure.
Jalen Green would be a very optimistic outcome for Ron Holland, like who Jalen Green is right now, and people complain about Jalen Green as he is right now. So
right, who was a better scorer, shooter, and a better athlete, just not as tall, or you know.
Correct.
San Antonio, I guess you could make the case, but like now you're like, have you given up on Sohan? You know, like. Because Ron and that, like, I think you want shooting ideally around Wemby and Devin Vassell. I love, and I know that they said that, you know, there was a report by Gavoni that that Vassell and Wemby are the only 2 like untouchables on San Antonio, which I think is probably the right mindset to have. And if that's the case, then maybe there's an avenue for San Antonio. It's just not the direction I would go. So they have 2 shots at it. If that was the case, again, I think that they should go a different direction. Maybe there's an avenue for playing time there, potentially if they make some moves. Sure. But as it stands now, not really seeing it. Detroit, I mean, come on.
No. No. Nope. Not doing
Come on.
it.
I don't even want to break that down. But it would be such a old Detroit move. Like if, you know, Charlotte, maybe. You know, if you want to give him the Miles Bridges role, you know, LaMelo is certainly a guy that will help him finish efficiently. You know, let him get out of transition. You're not taking the ball out of Brandon Miller or LaMelo's hands, so like that's one where I could see that specific context building around those two guys could make some
they
sense
also
for
just
him.
need some defensive support as well, anywhere that they can get it. You may not agree
Yeah.
always with Ron Holland's style of defense, but what he would bring to the table
Sure.
in his style and his role would certainly be an upgrade over a lot of what Charlotte has.
Yeah, so I like that's to me the first spot where I go, okay, if you believe in the talent a lot, and I'm fully cognizant of what the talent is, I've seen it up close, then this is the one that makes the most sense for me. But is he the guy that Charlotte is going to love the most? Would be the question. Portland, like,
so that's the one that I actually like the most. That's the one I think it makes the most sense to me, because I think Scoot needs a transition running mate, right? I think how that team ideally wants to be molded, Ron could be that type of running mate with Scoot. And then that team just needs any semblance of defense that it can get. And I think Ron would be an upgrade on the wing. And I think he could certainly grow into, again, more than just the defensive type of player that he is now. So I think you give him the runway to allow him to do what he does best, along with a team that is going to be patient. It's going to give him plenty of developmental reps, who will take the lumps with the gains. I think that type of situation, to my eyes, is best for him. That's why I've had him mocked there on two different mocks. I think if I'm Portland at 7, I can really talk myself into drafting him, which would also make sense, at least for me personally. I have him, again, like I said, 6 on my board. That's the range where I'm really looking at him. I'm not necessarily looking at him in the top 5.
Yeah, I don't think that Portland is ready to give up on the Ant Simons Shaden like wing backcourt situation.
Sure.
And at that point, I look at him as more of a bench player.
He could become the 4 though if they move off of Jeremy Grant. Like I think there are multiple positional avenues for him to get minutes in somewhere like Portland, to where he's not necessarily locked into one thing where he can also take advantage of his strengths. Like it depends on how they're going to shuffle that roster around. There's a lot that would be up in the air. I agree with you out of the gate. It could be a little messy, but if they do move off Simons, if they do move off Grant, and they swing completely into this youth movement, I don't think a starting trio of Scoot, Shaden, and Ron Holland is necessarily a bad thing.
Scoot's going to have to shoot it in that case, I think.
Listen, man, you're talking to one of the last people on Scoot Henderson Island. So
we're not at No Ceilings. We're still on Scoot Henderson Island.
Maybe not you guys. It seems so. Maybe I'm just hopping back in on that island with you guys. I never necessarily left, but it seems like a lot of other people, took the first flight off that island, and they're not coming back to the timeshare. So
Rucker, Metcalf, Albert, and I saw Scoot play the Rockets in the last game of their season, and Scoot went for like 30 before he left the game in the third quarter, had a massive poster, hit like 6 threes, maybe would have been 7, but he had a foot on the line. Still very much a believer in Scoot Henderson.
Yep.
At No Ceilings. Yeah, I don't love the fit, but I get what you're saying. I think that makes some sense, especially they have that second pick if they want to go more into fitting the theme of their roster. Yeah. So and Memphis, it's like they have Gigi. They did the Zaire Williams thing. Like, I can't get there. Utah, I actually love for Ron as well, because they have a ton of spacing, guys who are going to have more usage. And so
they also just need defense any way they can get it.
Yeah. So that's kind of the other spot that I think is like the ideal landing spot for Ron in the top 10. So I do think that there are situations for him in the top 10 that could really work. I just think there are a lot of situations that really might not work. And it depends on how you view him and what he views himself as and how he is going to adjust. Because, a lot of people in the chat are making a lot of good points. He's still crazy young, and he has a lot of runway. He has played in multiple contexts. He has grown his game a ton. And if he's a competitor and he's willing to work his tail off, a lot of what I'm saying is probably going to get clipped on the internet, and I hope it does. I really, truly hope it does. There are pathways. I just think he's pretty volatile. Now, Alex says, I don't know why swinging on Ron is worse than Salaun. I think Nate and I both gave Salaun a worse volatility index grade than,
we did, yeah,
than Ron. So
we did.
But yeah, I think, you know, if I bought into Ron's shot a little bit more, I could be more optimistic. That's the other thing. Like, I don't think his rim pressure is valuable enough that the shot lacking so much, like, it can make up for that fact.
So out of guys in my top 10, he's probably the most volatile out of guys in my top 10. If I had to rank a 3 really quick, it would be Holland. We already talked about Smith, and I would also throw Risa Share in there. And that would be my top 3 most volatile, with Ron taking that spot. So that doesn't mean I'm not going to have him 6th on my board. It just means that I'm fully acknowledging, like,
it's a risk.
Could go south.
It's a swing.
Absolutely.
You're trying to hit a homer.
Second team after 2 years. Yep.
Yeah, you're trying to hit a triple or a homer, but you might be swinging in the dirt.
Yep.
Sometimes those things end up out of the park.
Sometimes.
You know, so
if you're Aaron Judge or Juan Soto, shout out to you, Albert. Sometimes those things work out, but sometimes you're not one of those guys. So
yeah. Well, I think that's going to do it, because, you know, honestly, like you said, we don't like to get too negative, and I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to be honest in my evaluation. I can definitely say I'm a little pessimistic in my evaluation, but I'm rooting for this to be clipped and me to be wrong. 100%.
And I do think, like, when we talk about this, just to put a nice little bow on this, when we talk about the pessimism around the 2024 draft, I don't think it's necessarily because there may not be a lot of all-stars in this class, or the depth in this class might be where you're finding the real value and it takes you a little while to get down there. I think it's that there are very talented guys, even near the top of this class, but it's because they have these floors that are so much lower than other prospects we'd find in these ranges in other drafts. I think that's why it's scary. I think that's why people are more negative on this draft. In my opinion, I don't think it's that there's no talent. It's that a lot of these picks could go really south really fast. And yeah, it is a little scary, but at the same time, if you're doing your homework and you trust your scouting process, you trust your philosophy that you're grading these guys on, and you believe in your evaluation, then it becomes a little less scary. You just got to go find your guy.
Yeah, it's a risk tolerance thing for sure. Yep. You know, it's, some teams might want to be a little more risk averse because they feel like the risk isn't worth the reward, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. But there's definitely talent in this draft. This has been probably the most fun draft cycle that, you know, I've been a part of. You know, like, outside of the first one that I did maybe publicly, where I was having a lot of fun and learning a lot and whatnot. But, like, this has been the most fun that I've had at No Ceilings. Like, there's so many disagreements in our Slack channel. You know, like, I try to mention Zach Edey to Tyler Rucker. You know,
what's the famous one at 27? What's the famous one from the mock draft room? Who was the divisive player that caused a lot of upheaval?
The divisive one?
Yeah.
From this last one, the most divisive argument was probably me and Maxwell going at it about Modest Buzelis.
Oh boy.
Which is available on the No Ceilings Plus, or not yet, will be available on No Ceilings Plus.
Oh, the Mark Sears one. That's what it was.
Mark Sears at 27. Yeah. The previously Mark Sears went for the pick that he was at. We did not need to go in as deep as we did, but that's what you get when you subscribe to No Ceilings Plus. That's right. You get to see us in our process. So, Nate, man, we went for 2 hours and 15 minutes. There's, between Twitter and YouTube, we have over 1,200 people watching live right now, and they've been with us for the majority of this time. So, you know, if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe and like, and comment. Even if you want to tell me that my Ron Holland take is insane and I'm an idiot, that's fine too. But just getting the opportunity to chop it up with you for 2 hours has been, you know, a real joy. I miss your voice on the podcast feed on my commutes. I think, you know, you're one of the best podcasters in the space. You know, your writing, obviously talented writer, everything you did at No Ceilings, but you know, the weekly podcast commute has been missed. But I'm excited to see everything that, you know, now that you're starting to come out in public a little bit more. You know, I'm excited. You teased something, so tell people what you teased and go as far, as deep as you want. You don't have to, I know you just put out a teaser, so you don't have to go super deep, but you could just tease it if you want, or you can, tell the people.
I did tease something. So a passion project of mine, something that I would love to be able to turn into a sustainable form of income myself in whatever way, shape, or form. There's nothing that's been concrete, set in stone with what it's going to look like or where it's going to pop up, but something that's a passion project of mine will be called Youth Movement MBA. And really what that's going to do is offer people a deeper look into how these guys are actually developing and where their careers are actually going from the rookie year to their sophomore year to their junior year within their organization, and then running that analysis down to guys who are playing in the G League, right? Guys who are playing in the G League, maybe some guys who went overseas, went undrafted, but they may be guys who could come back. There's a lot of different ways that you can tackle the beast, but the biggest thing to come back to is that we're in the midst of a youth movement in the NBA right now. Like, young guys are taking over a lot sooner than I think people anticipated. And it's not just the top guys that deserve to have their stories told. There are a lot of talented players across multiple levels of basketball, both in the NBA and the G League, that deserve to have their stories told as well. And so I just want to be able to offer some insight into that, and certainly offer up a place where I can keep growing as an evaluator and as an appreciator of basketball, and a lot of other people can as well by seeing different perspectives on different players. So that's really what I'm going to be working on. I'm expecting to launch that in some way, shape, or form in September. Can't guarantee that it's going to be podcast/video oriented right out of the gate, but you can expect some written words from me starting up sometime in September, wherever that lands as a little teaser. So,
well, I'm excited for all of that. I'm excited that I got to chop it up with you. I'm excited everyone gets to listen to you for 2 hours and 15 minutes of conversation on the podcast feed. It's been a minute, and you're always invited back. So appreciate you joining, man. One last time, tell everybody where they can find you on the internet.
You can find me on Twitter, still at Draft Deeper. And certainly, please, if you're not subscribed to No Ceilings, I would assume that you are, but you absolutely should be, because these guys, this year that I've been absent from the collective, these guys have continued to grow even beyond what I could have imagined. And No Ceilings is still the king when it comes to the draft space. 5 days a week draft coverage, any way you can get it. So please make sure you're subscribed. And Corey, you shared some kind words about me. No one's doing the video breakdowns like you, brother. You are doing some special work on the No Ceilings TV YouTube channel. So please keep that going. Everyone, check out all those videos. You referenced the Tyler Smith one, but Corey's been pumping them out at an insane pace. So please go check out that incredible content. It's been awesome to watch.
And if you are looking for an internship and you are a video editor, maybe stay tuned and you can help out next year. But until next time, make sure you rate, review the podcast. Come back tomorrow for more 5-day-a-week coverage at No Ceilings NBA. We're less than a month away. Good things are happening. Appreciate everybody chopping up with us. We're out. Peace.